I'm Gavin Landgraf. I'm a senior at CMC, and my topic today is about Adam Smith and the duality and totality of his works. And my thesis is that you really can't understand the wealth of nations, which is a concept, and I mean the concepts in that work are central to so much of what we talk about at CMC, but we can't really understand them fully without understanding the precursor to Wealth of Nations, which was the theory of moral sentiments. So that's what I want to talk about today. This is a more academic talk. That doesn't mean it has to be more boring. I hope you find it interesting. I think I'm really passionate about this. I think it's fascinating. So hopefully you do too. I passed out beforehand some pieces of paper on the seats around because there's a bunch of quotations from the theory of moral sentiments as well as from the Wealth of Nations that are really important to this discussion. And so I'm looking at them now, but if you want to follow along with that works better than having slides because then you can flip back and forth from the initial quotations to the final quotations at your will. Before I get into the topic, I wanted to make a couple of caveats or pre-points for the audience. The first is that I'm a huge fan of Adam Smith, so I think that there's a little bit of bias, but at the same time, I think that you may not think I'm a fan in the way that you think I am, because I think Adam Smith, as I said, is misunderstood to some extent, and he's not necessarily the cruel, unfeeling capitalist that he's been made out to be just by taking excerpts from the Wealth of Nations. Second, I just wanted to make note of the dates at which he was writing. So he wrote Wealth of Nations before, he wrote Theory of Moral Sentiments before Wealth of Nations, and the time, it was the middle of the 1700s. He wrote Wealth of Nations in 1776. And at the time, we all recognized that this was earth-shattering stuff at the time. It was new, and it became the foundation for economics and some political philosophy for centuries to come. But it's really that latter point that I think we need to emphasize, which is that it's not just that he shook things up at the time, it's that these ideas have lasted. But unfortunately, they haven't lasted quite in the correct way. I think that we need to return to that original thesis of Smith and really understand, again, the full totality and duality of these two particular works. So I want to get started with the first point, which is on this piece of paper, which is the concern. And that is that if you read Wealth of Nations, you get a sense of capitalist economics having a underpinning that's fully egoist. So obviously this isn't actually how it works, because if we were fully egoist in our economics and in our daily lives, we'd quickly devolve into Rousseau's State of Nature or some other form of anarchy. If everyone were just throwing all constraints to the wind and simply considering their self-interest, we'd have a lot of problems. But I think Smith's point in The Wealth of Nations is, as it says in this quotation about the invisible hand, by directing that industry in such a manner as its produce may be the greatest value, he intends only his own gain, and he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. Nor is it always the worse for the society that it was no part of it. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. Now, you may not notice this, but this is pretty much the CMC motto, if you read this section. So I think this is particularly applicable to CMC because the idea that civilization prospers with commerce is right here in the invisible hand passage, where he's saying, even if you're pursuing your self-interest, everyone's going to be better off because you're going to have a greater GDP, you're going to have more wealth, you're going to have specialization and trade and commerce, and that's going to result in improvements for everyone across the board. But what he's not saying, he doesn't explicitly say this, but what's clear in the context of theory of moral sentiments is that he's not saying that all you should do is pursue your self-interest. There's clearly constraints here that aren't being mentioned, because if you did, then there wouldn't be any rules and there wouldn't be any trade to engage in, because it would just be an anarchistic state. So there's clearly something here that's missing from Wealth of Nations, and that's where we have to turn to the theory of moral sentiments to find those constraints that he left out because he was assuming people were reading both works together. So the impact is that unconstrained egoism makes for a pretty rough society. I mentioned that, Smith mentions that in Theory of Moral Sentiments, that if the classic example is a society of robbers and murderers. Even if there is any society among robbers and murderers, they must at least, according to the trite observation, abstain from robbing and murdering one another. So this is one of his more famous quotations from the theory of moral sentiments, and it's the idea that even if you have a group that doesn't even view the law as binding on themselves, they break the law at every chance, they still, in order to form a productive society, have to have some sort of constraint. So constraint is central to his thesis in the theory of moral sentiments, but that's not entirely clear in The Wealth of Nations, unless you're going back and reading this theory. The second point that results from this is that there's a need. There's clearly a need for constraint, and Smith is going to provide the basis for that in the theory of moral sentiments. So the quotation talks about his observations of justice as being a product of our nature. This is an interesting point. This is where Smith is acting almost as like a psychologist here, and saying that nature has implanted in the human breast that consciousness of ill desert, those terrors of merited punishment, which attend upon its violation as the great safeguards of the association of mankind to protect the weak, to curb the violent, and to chastise the guilty. This is the concept that later philosophers like Christine Korsgaard would call the facts of morality, the feelings that we associate with morality, like the guilt that we get when we either act in a way that's against our conscience, or when we see someone else acting in a way that violates some standard that we have of wrong and right. So these are the feelings of morality, and I think Smith is on right here. I think this is correct, that he's grounding the constraints in some sort of either biological or psychological sense of morality. The problem is that this isn't sufficient to explain why we should consider these feelings as actually binding upon us. So if you break this down, and he does in the watch metaphor, this is another famous part of the theory of moral sentiments, there's both an expedient end to morality, and then there's the final end to morality. So the expedient end and the expedient method of getting to morality is through these feelings, but the final end is actually the underlying obligation, which is normative and actually something that's binding upon people, not just a feeling that you're going to go against if you go against your conscience, but an actual rule that is binding upon you that you'll be violating. So he makes this the metaphor of a watch, which I think is really illuminating here. He presents the idea that the individual components of the watch are not aiming at the final goal, which is telling time, right? So the spring is just trying to unwind. The spring just wants to unwind. It has no idea, if you're personifying the spring, it has no idea that the overall purpose that it's a part of is the attempt for the whole watch to tell time. But at the same time, just because the spring is only aiming at unwinding and not telling time doesn't mean that the overall purpose of the watch isn't something greater, and that is the purpose of telling time. So if you take this metaphor and take it back to this concept of our feelings of justice and apply it there, the result is that you see what this distinction that it really took another 100 years to really fully flesh out between the explanatory effects or explanatory adequacy of morality and then the justificatory adequacy of a theory of morality. So explanatory means, can the theory explain why we feel like we have to obey these certain rules? And in this case, it seems like Smith's theory can. He's saying we have these statements that are grounded in nature. You could then update that post-Darwinian theory and say that they're given to us by evolution, and these feelings are grounded in us because they're a survivable trait. But he hasn't given us the justificatory aspect yet. He hasn't explained to us why we actually ought to view them as binding on ourselves. And that's where I would argue the theory of moral sentiments gets really earth-shattering, when he does provide that new justificatory explanation for why we actually are bound by these sentiments. So this is the third and final point, which is the idea of the impartial spectator and the underlying obligation to constraint. So there's a long quotation. I think it's all important, but the most important parts are in bold, naturally. And it says, though his own happiness may be of more importance to him than that of all the world besides, to every other person it is of no more consequence than that of any other man. When he views himself in the light in which he is conscious that others will view him, he sees that to them he is but one of the multitude, in no respect better than any other in it. If he would act so as that the impartial spectator may enter into the principles of his conduct, which is what of all things he has the greatest desire to do, he must, upon this, as upon all other occasions, humble the arrogance of his self-love and bring it down to something which other men can go along with. This is the key component of the Wealth of Nations that's missing, that we've missed, that you have to have constraints on this self-love in order for the market that he's describing in wealth of nations to actually operate effectively. So this is the constraint that I was talking about earlier that was missing. And it's grounded in this concept that we're all, we can suspend our personal perspective for a moment, exit our bodies essentially in our perspective, and view ourselves as we're viewed by the rest of the world, which is 1 in billions, right? So I exit my body, I view myself, and I regard myself and my own interests as everyone else in this room is viewing them, which is just as one other person in billions. So even though, yes, I do want to put my interests first, I'm a self-interested being, just like the being that he describes in Wealth of Nations, at the same time, there's this constraint that's placed on you because of our ability to understand that we're all autonomous, equal beings, and we're able to sympathize with that understanding. So this is, as I was saying earlier, this is really, really new. This is something that's pre-Kant, which is surprising because he's grounding the concept of morality and constraints in the rationality of them. That is something that all men can accept. We put constraints on our self-love because we know that everyone has to accept some sort of standards, and it has to be one that everyone, through this impartial spectator standpoint, would bind themselves to. So really quickly, I think I'm pretty much I'm actually over time, but I just wanted to close by talking about the implications of this. So why is all of this important? It's important because the classic problems of capitalism, right? The ones that Wealth of Nations can't solve, collective action problems, for example, where self-interest is understood as the Wealth of Nations describes it, can't lead to the proper solution, right? You follow your self-interest, it tells you to defect every time. Classic game theory, right? You defect because it's clear that it's the better choice regardless of whether the other group is not defecting. In fact, it's the best. If the rest of the group is not defecting, that's the best if you can defect when everyone else isn't. But even if everyone else is defecting, it also doesn't make sense for you to continue to constrain yourself. You also should be defecting. But this is the key to explaining collective action problems that is missing from the Wealth of Nations that Smith assumed we would all understand because of his previous work. And the idea is that if you take this impartial spectator standpoint, defection's not an option because you're viewing yourself as everyone else views you. And because of that, your interests in defection are no higher than anyone else's, and you violating that obligation is against the constraint that's been placed. So that is, I think I'm way over time now, so I should probably stop. But this is interesting to me, and I'd love to hear your questions. I mean, I'm sure most of you probably are just as informed on this topic as I am, so I'll do my best to answer, but we'll see how it goes.
Any questions?